city in the stars in a velvet sky, with no city lights a-burning. The meadow is aglow with fireflies, the air thick as cream for the churning. Listening in the dark to the hooting of the owls, a long ways away a coyote howls. Deep in the woods in a long cool valley where the water runs clear as gin, I open my heart and drink my fill of the rich deep current of life always running through these Ozark Hills.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's program, These Ozark Hills. My name is Mark Livengood. I'm the director of the Story Center at Mid-Continent Public Library. This year, the Story Center is partnering with the University of Missouri Extension's Community Arts Program to offer a series of unique programs that commemorate the Missouri State Bicentennial. Called State of Stories, this series of free public programs features book conversations, humanities programs, workshops, and storytelling performances, such as tonight's, that explore the history and culture of the Show Me State. Funding has been provided in part by the Ewing Marion Kaufman Foundation. Tonight's program features Marideth Sisco, and here to introduce Marideth is Dr. Lisa Overholser, Director of the St. Louis Storytelling Festival and Field Specialist with Extension's Community Arts Program. Welcome, Lisa.
Hi. Thanks, Mark. I'm honored to be here on behalf of the University of Missouri Extension and the St. Louis Storytelling Festival. And I'm pleased to introduce our storyteller, Marideth Sisco. She is a master Missouri storyteller, veteran journalist, teacher, author, musician, and student of folklore. And she's participated in the Missouri Folk Arts Program, Traditional Arts Apprenticeship Program as a master storyteller. She hosts the public radio show These Ozark Hills on KSMU FM, and spent 20 years as an investigative and environmental writer for the West Plains Quill. She's also well known for her gardening column Crosspatch, on which her recent book of gardening stories is based. Some may know her best as a musical consultant and featured singer in the award-winning feature film Winter's Bone. She's a wonderful raconteur, and we are proud to host her tonight as part of the State of Stories program. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Marideth Sisco.
Hi. Oh my, that radio show. In 2007, we got public radio down here into the deep Ozarks for the first time. And I was so grateful because I just didn't think I could live here without public radio. And so they put the programming down here, but they wanted something local. And so I was approached and asked to do kind of an interview show where I'd interview people that were of interest and do stories about them. And I said I would do that. But then as time went on, I ran out of people to interview, and I still had the show and I had that slot to fill. And so it sort of changed a little bit. So without getting too far involved in that, and you have to be careful with me because I wander off and talk too long. I just, what can I say? Anyway, this is the first installment of that show, which was in May of 2007. This is Marideth Sisco. I don't know if I'm quite as old as these Ozark Hills, but I'm a bona fide Ozarks native. My mother's family, the Gentrys and Fergusons, were English and Scotch and one Cherokee great-grandmother. They were mostly Republicans, mostly storekeepers and postmasters, and a host of other shy and responsible people who loved me, but who wish I would neither sing so loudly nor talk on the radio. My father's people, the Siscos, came up from New Orleans to settle in Carroll County, Arkansas. They were English and Spanish mostly, and one Cherokee great-grandmother. They were thrown out of Spain or some country over there for trying to overthrow the king. But in America, with no king to overthrow, they were forced to become sheriffs and auctioneers and orators, mostly Democrats, who were apt to burst into song or engage in hijinks at the least provocation. Until they died, my parents maintained a lively and fractious alliance between those factions, and took great delight in going to the polls every election to cancel each other's votes. Growing up in the Ozarks, moving away and coming home, I've seen it from both sides, and I know it's not always meant as a compliment when someone says, "You're not from here, are you?" You may have heard about the farmer who chided a man who'd only lived here for 20 years and said he was beginning to feel like a native. "Well, you'll never be that," the farmer said. "Well, no," the man said, "but my children." "No," the farmer said. "Well, wait, what do you mean? They were born here." "Well," the farmer said, "if your cat had kittens in the oven, would you call them biscuits?" Anyway, I cut my teeth on stories like that and about bushwhackers and bank robbers. My Aunt Juanita told the story of visiting her sister Bibi when she lived in a house at Newtonia that had been the Union Army headquarters in the war, the Civil War, and how she went to sleep counting the bullet holes in the wall. Now it's a historic site. Then it was just Aunt Bibi's house. I became a journalist because of those stories. When I wrote on the history of Thomasville in Oregon County, Missouri, the folks at the history magazine Ozarks Watch asked to reprint it. But when they did, they took out all the stories about the people. They said, "That's not history, that's just folklore." Well, as smart as that fellow at the magazine was, and no matter how well I liked him, he was definitely not from here. I recall he used to tell about going out to do field work and being invited to these country people's houses for dinner, and he would laugh at the idea that someone would stir mustard and chop onions into mashed potatoes and call it a salad. And I would be thinking, "Well, sir, if it's all they have to eat and they've worked hard to get it and they're willing to share it with you, I figure they can, by God, call it anything they please." But he was a good man with good intentions, and he loved this place. He wouldn't have stayed on, and neither would his children. Maybe one of these days we'll quit calling them biscuits. About 10 years or so ago, we went back to Newtonia to see the old brick house where Bibi lived. The family who lived there had just mowed the lawn, and we all got a surprise, for we had lived with a mythology that said no African American people had ever lived in our area. But outside the iron pickets of the family cemetery, there was another cemetery with fieldstone markers without names or dates. That's where the slaves were buried, you see. They were outside the fence. They weren't from here. You know, I'm just another hillbilly with an opinion, but at my age, I remember an Ozarks that is fast passing away. When this generation of people is gone, the stories we tell of this place may be all we have left of it. Back in 91, some hikers touring the Alps found a man who had been frozen in ice for more than 5,000 years. On his skin were tattooed acupuncture points, marks made 3,000 years before the Chinese invented it, and we call it experimental medicine. If we hadn't found those fragments of a man, we'd never have known that. Fragments. Sometimes that's all we have, though, like pottery shards giving us clues to lost civilizations. Here in the Ozarks, though, there's still a unique and somewhat peculiar culture very much alive, just waiting to be explored. And then the essays that follow, that's what we'll do. So that was the first one. And then I started exploring the history of my area in West Plains. I wasn't from here. I was from over in Berry County. I was close. So I found this story that really enraged people because of the notion of the just owning this person. But let me tell you about it. I'd like to tell you about Polly Langston. Polly was a poor little orphan girl who was befriended by a doctor from Marshfield, Missouri, while he was on a trip to New Orleans. She only spoke a few words of Spanish, and it was believed she came from Cuba. He took her home to his wife and son, where she became a member of the family. But then came that great tornado, the Marshfield cyclone of 1880, that killed more than 100 people, and the doctor's family was not spared. Let's let West Plains historian Dorothy Reva pick up the tale from that morning when volunteers from surrounding communities came to search for survivors, and Dorothy told me this. They heard what they thought was a baby cry, "Mama, oh mama," and it was Polly. She was near Dr. Bradford, and they found that he was dead. They finally located Mrs. Bradford. She'd been blown out in the field, and she was so badly bruised that she was almost beyond recognition. But Polly knew her, and she was comforted. But after that, she just kept saying, "Hey, Ma, where's Pa?" And this really disturbed Mrs. Bradford, who finally decided to send Polly to West Plains to her daughter, who was married to Thomas Jefferson Langston. After that, Polly was so afraid of storms that every time she heard thunder, she'd begin to cry and just have a fit. And they'd have to get a heavy quilt and cover Polly so she couldn't hear the thunder so much, and she was comforted that way. Polly, when she was a teenager, had been taught to sing, and she had a favorite hymn that was called How Firm the Foundation that she would sing quite frequently. And when she sang, she insisted that someone in the family go to the piano and play for her. Now, Mrs. Langston was host to the Ladies' Aid Society that met at her house regularly, and Polly was always there and would listen to the ladies talking. And after they'd leave, Polly would have a conversation with herself, and she would say, "Well, goodbye, Mrs. Smith. It was awfully nice having you. Oh, the cream was delicious." Polly was just so loved by the family, and not only was she really liked by the family, but everyone in West Plains loved her. The Langston family lived on what now is Langston Street, across from Robertson Drago Funeral Home, and Polly spent a lot of time out on their front porch, and she'd take time to talk to people as they passed by. So she became really popular all over Howell County and was much respected and loved by the citizens of our area. Polly was born in 1867, and in 1920, almost 53 years later, she died. And the family loved her so much they couldn't think of anything to do but to take her to the Oak Lawn Cemetery and bury her in the Langston burial plot. And she has her own little tombstone that says Polly, 1867 to 1920. It's an interesting tale with an interesting twist that made Polly's death noteworthy in newspapers nationwide. You see, Polly was a parrot, one of the more exotic birds to pass through these. Ran out of people to interview. It's not that no one else had an interesting story, just that they either didn't want to tell it just then, or they'd gone to Texas for the holidays, or they had some other lame excuse like being in the hospital or something, and I was on a deadline. So I just wrote something out of my own story and delivered it, and people seemed to take it well. And so the series at this point began to take on a life of its own, supplemented by my own history of storytelling, both the listening to and the telling of, what we in the Ozarks refer to as Wendy's. Truth is, after Christmas, I got a few more interviews with some interesting folks. I about decided the previous stories were just a stopgap, but no. Sooner or later, I'd go down the path of no return. A word of caution. Soon, it'll be time to batten down the hatches. There's a world of Wendy's ahead. So it goes on for a way, and I got to November, and I was supposed to write something about Thanksgiving. And, at that time, the story was coming at the end of the month, so it was after Thanksgiving that it was due. And I had just had a really, not really a disquieting experience, but not one of those full of holiday cheer, although some. But I wrote a different kind of story, and that's when I started digging farther into my own history. So this is the November 2007 episode called "To Be Thankful." Like many of you, I went traveling over the Thanksgiving holiday. I went down south to the land of cotton and rice and long straight highways. On the way down, I didn't know the roads, and so all my attention was on the map. But on the way back, I knew the road. Everything on local radio was either canned or bad for my blood pressure. And I was coming back from days of long conversations with the people I've known and who've known me for a long time. So I was replaying those conversations in my head. We talked about the struggle to find thankfulness in the wake of Katrina, ill health, children coming home from long distances and longer estrangements, and those still struggling to find their way. We grieved the passing of loved ones and the vast sadness that is now the Gulf Coast and the city of New Orleans after Katrina. So much of what was previous. Let me start again. So much of what was precious is now scattered to the winds. But then Wilma made her father's famous apple pie. I made Aunt Juanita's famous homemade noodles. Brenda candied the yams. Wanda made a toast, and we took a healthy dose of good food, good wine, and great stories of days gone by. We laughed long, cried a little, and found our way into the spirit of the day with pumpkin pie on the side. Good medicine indeed. Brenda said that while we may all look like we've been through the mill, our voices are still those same young voices we've always known, that laugh and joke and wonder what the big deal is about getting old anyway. That was some return trip, crossing those barren fields, threading the strings of tiny towns where farmers recuperated from the holiday feast, while wondering what their wives and kids were spending on Black Friday in Little Rock or Memphis or Jonesboro, and if they'd have enough coin for their dreams. People are worried these days, especially in the farmlands. This whole country seems to have been on a long trip down a lonely road of late, and if there is an end in sight, nobody is telling us about it. Even our planet home doesn't seem all that safe anymore. All the more reason, I think, to take time, not just on a special day, but every time we get the chance to give thanks for what's important to us. just so we don't forget. Me, for instance, I'm thankful for my health, what there is left of it, and for the people who love me enough to help me make better choices. I'm thankful for my family and for yours. Don't ever take them for granted. Years pass, and so do people, and the older you get, the fewer people remember that your voice is still young and carefree. I'm thankful for the ties of friendship like those renewed this weekend and the ones right here on the air. What a fine day. I'm thankful for the people and for the people I don't even know who make my life better by doing their jobs well, not for applause or rewards, but because it's the right thing to do. We don't ever thank them enough. Of course, I finally made it back to the end of the flatlands where the road begins to twist and twine its way up toward the Ozarks, back where the air is sweeter and folks don't have an accent. I hope your holiday was as warm and heart-filling as mine was, and if you didn't get the chance to say thank you enough to those who make your life better and fuller and richer, there's still time. Giving thanks. May it never go out of season. So just that next month, it's still hard times, and I'm still watching it and feeling like I need to say something that is near that I can come to relevant. And so the very next month, I wrote, right after Christmas, The Longest Night. Ever since we first began to walk on our hind legs, humans have pondered the behavior of this strange, wobbly planet that wanders its tipsy way through space, rolling and weaving like a top. It gives us summer and winter, the seasons, the solstices, and the holidays that have gathered around them. Among these is the passing of the longest night, and how its darkness generates the hope of the light to come. What an incredible metaphor, and how deeply it speaks to us. It has given us traditions that go back thousands of years, from the Ramadan of the Muslims, the Hanukkah of the Jews, to the many and varied celebrations of Christmas. Oh, we may huff and puff over what a Christmas tree means, and whether it's a Christian symbol or a pagan one, but whether a Christmas tree, the menorah's candles, or the glow of the Yule log, they all bring light to the long winter's night. Down here in the Ozarks, most of us have come to that long winter's night with a good helping of memories of seasons, holidays, loved ones, present and past, and stories to share by the fire and warm our hearts while the cider and good company take care of the rest. Here's one to add to that batch. When I was just a little bitty kid, I was very worried about Christmas. I thought Santa wouldn't be able to come and see me at all. You see, I had been fretting about it for some time because we were living in this big, drafty old house that had been the town hotel in Butterfield, Missouri. We were living in just the rooms that we could heat in the winter with an old wood stove, and there was no fireplace. I could see that the chimney was just up on the wall with just a little bitty hole for the stovepipe. And how in the world would Santa Claus get down there? Well, he couldn't. Well, Christmas Eve came, and there I was fretting about Santa, and all of a sudden I heard this big ho, 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 and the front door opened, and by golly, in walked Santa Claus, tall and all in red and with a white beard and everything. I had never seen anyone so tall, except for Uncle Leonard, my Aunt Juanita's new husband, and he was gone off to town somewhere. Santa came in and set me up on his knee and reached into his sack and pulled out these very cool toy telephones that really rang and talked to each other, and these little cars and trucks and candy and, well, I just don't know what all. I could hardly look at the toys because there he was, big as life, bigger. And then Santa Claus explained that what with the chimney's problem and all, he couldn't land on the roof and he had to land in the yard, which was tricky. He didn't want to be seen by anybody, so he really had to get going. He sat me down, stood up, and off down the hall and out the front door he went. Well, hey, I was nobody's fool. If Santa Claus was parked in the yard and if I hurried, I could see me some reindeer. So I was off down the hall like a shot right behind him with my mom and dad and Aunt Juanita calling after me. Well, I guess Santa realized I was on his heels because he made a left turn at the front door and tore off around the side of the house at a dead run. Now, I don't know where he put his sleigh, but I do know that's where we'd put the wood pile. And I don't really remember this part of the story, but I am told that when I came back to the kitchen with my eyes full of wonder, I said, when Santa Claus cusses, he sounds just like Uncle Leonard. I swear they told that story on me every Christmas until I was the only one of them left, and now I tell it on myself. It's what we do on the long winter nights to warm our hearts and make the winter go quicker and bring back the light. And I guess this old wobbly planet listens because it's already leaning back toward the sun, and mornings are getting a little bit longer every day. Whatever your tradition, it's easy to see that when we went looking for a holy season, this was a good place to put it. May this holiday season find you well and happy, your days lengthening and the light in your life strengthening. So it went on for a while, and we got into the next year. And it got around to the middle of the summer, and politics were creeping around, and I wasn't, it's public radio. I'm not supposed to talk about politics. I'm not supposed to have an opinion, and that was a lot like being a journalist, because I had trained myself to not take sides, because that's not what you do. You have to stay in the middle. My boss used to say that if you made everybody mad, you were in about the right place. So I wrote this. It's called Something Might Be Gaining on You. Summer is upon us. The farmers' markets are bursting at the seams with the fruit of the farmers' labor, but even in this season of plenty, it seems it's a season of discontent too, and it's not just the heat. High prices at the pump are making it harder to fill the pantry, and the news seems worse every day. Those of us old enough to remember talk of what it was like in the 30s wonder if we may be gearing up for another long run of bad times. I think about what Satchel Paige say, don't look back, because something might be gaining on you. Now, I know it doesn't pay to get too excited about the national news for a couple of reasons. Some of what happens out there doesn't get all the way here. My mother said that in the Great Depression, nothing much changed except nobody had any money. But since they didn't have any money to begin with, they hardly noticed it. The other thing is the news isn't what it used to be. Time was, you could tell the difference between the super-smart tabloids with their three-headed Martian babies born to an Arkansas teenager and the more reputable sources that would just give you the facts. But by the time today's corporate media managers get through with the news, we don't know if what we're getting is just what there is, or just what somebody thinks we ought to think. Just the other day, I saw an article in USA Today that talked about families who had adjusted well to the recent changes in the economy by growing a garden, raising chickens, and substituting stews for their steaks and peas for their pate. I thought that was charming. I might have tried that, except I was already doing stews and peas, and the dogs the town folks left at my place had already killed all my chickens. So those ideas really didn't help me much. But the next day, there was an article in the Chicago Tribune about a group of African American people led by their minister who left the Chicago area in the 1960s and settled on a large farm near Cape Girardeau, Missouri. They took their children out of the city to raise them nearer to the life they had lived in rural Mississippi. They took them, as they said, back to the promised land. Those children, now grown and with families of their own, described it as a paradise. But for them, it has become paradise lost. The children, having once known city life, took jobs off the farm instead of learning the skills of farm life, and where their parents and grandparents could grow corn and sorghum, raise pigs and chickens and cows, and feed the community on what they raised, the children could only make money. Now the land lies fallow, the children live in town and bicker over what to do with their lost heritage and dreams. A sad tale, especially when placed against the blithe chatter about raising chickens and growing a garden as the quick and easy fix to our worsening economic woes. No mention is made of the months of effort and expense between the chicken and the egg, between the seed and the tomato. If we think gasoline is expensive, what might be the cost of a little good sense? Those two stories called up a serious question in my mind. I know how to make do, and so do a lot of country people my age, but what about this generation now, who has no memory of hard times or how to survive them? I'm thinking it might be time we started making a bigger fuss over the gardeners, the librarians, the wisdom keepers, those who remember how to do or find out things people may need to learn to do for themselves, things that in hard times help keep a civilization civil. We might start by teaching that basic Ozarks rule, the one right after take care of each other. Right after take care of each other. It goes like this: use it up, wear it out, make it do or do without. Maybe not as catchy as trading pate for peas, but more likely to get us through the hard times in these Ozark Hills. So we got through that hard time, and life turned the way it turned, and we kept up with it as best we could. And a woman that I knew only through my mother died. And I had a long time to think about that because she had been a big feature in our lives, and I had talked to her shortly before she died, and learned things that I hadn't known. And it seemed that when I sat down to write, and by then I had, by then I had adopted the habit of not deciding what to write about until I sat down and wrote, "This is Marideth Sisco for these Ozark Hills." And so this is what came out of me then, and I think it's one of the better pieces I've done, but it surprised me. Early this week, I made the long drive over to what used to be home to pay my respects to those who've gone on before. In this case, it was to Mount Pleasant Cemetery near Butterfield, Missouri. Memorial Day has always been problematic for me, maybe because I never heard it called anything but Decoration Day until I was grown. And by the time I was grown, I'd already made several trips to that cemetery on other somber occasions that had other names. I lost both my parents when I was in my early 20s, and by that time, I'd already lost both grandfathers, my great aunt Laura, who would rock me to sleep, and my great uncle Tom, who taught me how to sing. So I had decided I had enough of cemeteries, and I didn't get the whole decorating thing, so I didn't see what there was to celebrate. For a long time, I had nothing to do with the cemetery at Mount Pleasant, and I persuaded myself it had nothing to do with me. Well, sometimes a person gets wiser, and sometimes they just get old. If they're lucky, they finally learn that the resentment of being abandoned by those you love, if you let it, can turn into gratitude for all the love and knowledge they left behind to sustain you. I didn't let it. Not for a long time. Then in 1988, a tornado touched down in Butterfield and did tremendous damage, including one death. When I heard the news, my thoughts went racing back over the miles and time, and for a moment I was overcome with concern for all the people I knew there. Then I realized that every single one of those I worried over had been dead for years. They were safe up on the hill at Mount Pleasant, out of harm's way. Things began to turn around for me then, although it took a few more years and a few more funerals before I finally got comfortable with revisiting all those ghosts and the memories they brought with them. It took one more death, that one not in the family, for me to finally grow up and claim all those memories as my own. You see, when my mother was a child, she had become fast friends with a little red-headed girl up the road named Johnny. They spelled it differently, so you'd know it wasn't a boy's name. She and Johnny stayed friends all through their growing up years, sharing adventures and confidences, my mother's of becoming a novelist and Johnny's of traveling the world. They vowed at the end of their adventures they would meet back in Butterfield and grow old together. Well, my mother married this handsome boy who joined the Navy at the start of World War II. She spent those years waiting for him to come home from traveling the world while her stories went untold. Johnny joined the Army Nursing Corps and was sent to London, where she worked in an Army hospital all the way through the Blitz and never got to go anywhere. When the war was over, she took a job in California, got married, and had 5 kids. She and my mother wrote letters back and forth, but hardly saw each other at all. They were reunited finally in the most poignant of circumstances after my father died and my mother came back to California with me to renew some of those old friendships. But she was ill and didn't know the cause. And Johnny, who was the head nurse at the local hospital by now, took her in for an exam. It was left to Johnny to tell her and me that she was dying. That was more than 40 years ago. Much later, when her children were grown and her husband had passed, Johnny came back to Butterfield to stay. And when I went to visit her shortly before she died, she told me that for all those years, whenever she came home to visit, she had come to Mount Pleasant and left a single yellow rose, the symbol of joy and friendship, on my mother's grave. She explained it by saying simply, "I loved her. You have to honor that. It's all there is." So I have taken a lesson from Johnny. I'm new at the custom of decorating graves, but now when I go over to Mount Pleasant to visit those I loved, I bring roses, pink ones for pure love and gratitude. There's one for my mother, one each for all the other friends and kin, and one for Johnny, who showed me how to come home. So, all the way around the calendar to another Christmas. And I started remembering those days when I lost my parents. My father died in May and my mother in September of the same year. I was 23 when it was over, and it took a lot of time before I was comfortable in my skin again. But during that time, I had the most wonderful of help, and I had a chance to write about it at this Christmas because it was time, I guess you'd say. So this is December of 2009. 'Tis the season again for holiday celebrations, whether Christmas, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, or solstice. The longest night of the year is upon us when the earth ceases its northern tilt and heads sunward again. If you're near Stonehenge or its little cousin that the engineering students built up at Rolla, Missouri, you can stand in the circle and see the sunrise in the notch reserved just for solstices. Certainly, the merchandisers are happy. People are buying presents like they did a decade ago, and certainly we're all looking at better times. But I think I caught myself saying Merry Christmas once too often while leaving the home of a family whose elderly mother is just out of intensive care and the outcome is still uncertain. It reminded me that for many folks in many places, the holiday season is often not all that merry. There are families with people serving overseas in grim situations, or in hospitals, or gone. People estranged from their loved ones by conflict or illness or distance, or older folks who've seen friends die, families dwindle, and days of silence where laughter used to be. This stirred up a memory of one of my darkest Christmases, the year my parents died. I was 23, out on my own, I thought, but then I found out what that really meant. I had roots in a tiny Ozarks town where my mother was the postmaster, like her mother and father before her. We had aunts, uncles, and cousins galore. I didn't even have to put an address on letters headed home. I just wrote postmaster, Butterfield, Missouri. Then, with hardly time to catch my breath, I was orphaned. Hang on a second. I had no home address. I spent Thanksgiving with an aunt who, like me, was still in Butterfield, but like me, was alone for the holiday. We drove out down into Arkansas to the AQ Chicken House for dinner. We talked long, told stories, laughed, and had a good time. But by Christmas, I was lost. I didn't know what to do, how to continue, or where I belonged. I couldn't just go back to what had been before. It was gone, and I couldn't bear the loss. It was a picture without a frame, a boat adrift, a castaway. On Christmas Eve, with a heavy heart, watching the snow blowing in drifts down the country lanes and more in the forecast, I remembered an invitation from an old friend in Springfield to come share Christmas, and I went. It was 70 miles up snow-covered highways in driving wind and cold, creeping around the curves, the defrosters not quite keeping up with the icing windshield wipers. It was exhilarating. I learned that night that adrenaline, carefully applied, can be a very handy if temporary first aid for a broken heart. My friend and fellow musician, Roger, lived with his mother, Pauline, in a tiny two-room, two-story house behind the old Sorosis house on Walnut Street. Today, that house is the Student Exhibition Center at MSU. Pauline, a gifted and prolific artist, suffered from severe rheumatoid arthritis. Her mother, who helped care for her, lived next door at the Sorosis Women's Club. That night, when I crept into the snow-covered parking lot between the two buildings, I found a path to the larger house had already been cleared for me by other vehicles. Pauline's brothers, Justin and Nelson Kiefer, had arrived with their families from their homes in Kansas and Oklahoma, and the house was lit with many lights. Music and laughter greeted me as I knocked, followed by warm hugs and merry greetings when I stepped through the door. Dinner was on the stove, and Justin was just about to unveil bottles of his newest batch of homebrew for us to sample. The bottles were handsome brown long necks with impressively printed labels, titles displayed in elegant Gothic script. I took one, inhaled the aroma, and then burst out laughing when I deciphered the name. It was called Kiefer's Rotten Socks. It was splendid, especially when combined with good food and good friends, some of them brand new. I have no recollection of the rest of that night. But the next day, more friends and family arrived, and we ate, we sang songs, and I left late in the afternoon on thawing roads, whistling a tune and feeling oddly that I had come back to earth from some faraway dark land. I understood then that there is always a larger family if they remember you, or even if they don't. Sometimes when you least expect it and you need them most, they'll take you in. After 40-some years, I still remember that Christmas. driving home in the afternoon sun with a full belly, a full heart, and a special gift of Christmas cheer, a six-pack of Kiefer's Rotten Socks. My Christmas wish is that we all remember we are part of that larger family and do our part to make sure no one is left out in the cold. So that's sort of the way it went for a time. That next year was better, and the year after that better still. And I kept writing in that pattern where you don't choose what you're going to say until you're saying it. You don't plan ahead and say, I'm going to write about this and I'm going to say these things. You don't make an outline. You write, this is Marideth Sisco for these Ozark Hills, and then see what happens. And so that was working for me during that time. And occasionally I'd have to look up some event and so that I could tell things accurately. But mostly I was relying on my memories and the memories that I was making as a journalist. And then after being a journalist, working for the newspaper, I heard so many people's stories that other than running out of things to say, it seemed like I couldn't keep up with the things to say. And so that was, I got really comfortable in that job. And then every once in a while, something would arrive that would just be so sparkly that it had to be told. I'd hear a story that was just too good, even if it wasn't my story. And I didn't have anybody to interview about it. I did wait until the people that had told me the story were all off to another place before I told it, because I didn't want to get anybody in trouble. But it was a wonderful story, and so I chose that one to share with you here because I just couldn't resist. This is called, and pardon me again, I'm drying up. Okay, I'm better. This is called Fortune Shining Down. If you're listening to this live on a Friday morning, you're either on your way to work at one of those jobs that don't let you have a 4-day weekend, or you finally made it inside of one of the big box stores and you're hoping that keeping your attention on NPR on your iPod will ward off a panic attack as you're watching someone carry off what might be your last chance at a new TV. If you're extremely lucky, you're sitting at home enjoying your morning coffee, thinking about dismantling the remains of yesterday's turkey and sending good wishes to your son, daughter, nephew, or spouse who is braving the crowd waiting for that TV. If fortune is shining down on you, you and everyone to whom you'd send good wishes are very happy with the TVs they have, and you are sticking to thoughts of turkey leftovers and anyone they might have forgotten to thank. I was going over my list last night when up popped someone or a group of someones I hadn't thought of in quite a while. They've all long gone from this plane and exist only as fond memories of a teacher, relative, or friend we once knew and still think the world of. I never knew them in the classroom, nor did I know any of them long enough or well enough for them to count me as a friend. Even so, I became a confidant, and the secret they told me would stay with me always. And since they've all gone on, I guess it's okay for me to share it with you. Some years back, the son of a former teacher engaged me to help his mother write her life story. She had taught in many one-room schoolhouses in earlier days and had many tales to tell of her experiences. I got to know her. I was impressed with not just her quick memory, but her delightful sense of humor and her light-hearted description of times which must have been very hard as she was growing up and helping her family make its way in the world. At one point, she told me, I may have grown up, but I'll never be a lady because when I laugh, it doesn't come out a laugh. I just giggle like a silly girl. I'd heard her laugh and I knew what she meant, but I found it charming, just like her stories. One story she told me was about her brother Bernard, who had set his mind on getting a degree in education so that he could become qualified to be a school administrator. His grades were excellent, and he had applied for a scholarship to a small college in Carthage, Missouri, and they had offered him a scholarship. The trouble was, he had no money to make the trip. So he took his small savings. Now, mind you, Carthage is 170 miles away from West Plains. So he took his small savings, tied his suitcase to the back of his bicycle, and pedaled away, headed from West Plains to Carthage. And this was in the 1930s, and most of the road from West Plains to Mountain Grove had not even been paved. It was just all rocks and tall hills. Well, by the time he reached Mountain Grove, he realized he could not continue that way. So he took what money he had, put his suitcase on the bus, and rode his bicycle the rest of the way. Good heavens, I said as Pauline finished the tale. That's almost unbelievable. She laughed. No, she said, that's just gumption. It's what you have to have if you're going to make it in this world. Well, she was right, I thought, but still. Well, time went by, and I mentioned to my older friends that I'd heard an amazing story about Bernard Smith. Oh, yes, they said, and he came back home and made a fine administrator. He worked all around this area for years. Well, I was impressed. I knew where Carthage was, and I realized I'd find the trip tiring if I made it by car. Then on the Sunday after Thanksgiving that year, I stopped by to visit Pauline and see if she was in the mood to tell me stories. But she had company. Her sister was there and her brother Bernard and his wife. They all had stories to tell, and I spent a lovely afternoon just listening. The afternoon grew late, and as I started to excuse myself, they all said, yes, it's late. We must be going to. It'll be dark soon. Yes, said Bernard, and it's hard enough for us to navigate in the daylight since I've gone blind. I started to laugh at the obvious joke, but no one laughed with me. Instead, they all looked embarrassed. Pauline put her hand up to her mouth, and her sister said, now, don't you start. But soon they were all laughing, and Pauline said, you might as well tell her. The secret's out. The truth was, Bernard really had lost his sight as a result of macular degeneration. He could only see a little bit out at the corners. Worse, he was the only one of them who could drive, and they lived out in the country. But how else were they to get to town, to the nursing home on Sundays to visit Pauline? Well, I don't know whose idea it was because they were all talking at once, but here's the gist of it. Every Sunday, when they figured out that everyone had gone to church and come home, the three of them would get in the car with Bernard behind the wheel, his wife snuggled up next to him, and his sister in the back seat leaning over his left shoulder. He drove, and they gave him constant feedback if he was too fast or too slow, too far left or right, and when to turn corners. Fortunately, although they lived 4 miles out of town, there were only 4 corners to manage, so they did it. They did it repeatedly. And when they finished talking and swearing me to secrecy, they sat back looking remarkably pleased with themselves. It was absolutely loony. But here they were, this little gumption-filled family, all in their 80s, except for Pauline, who was 92. She was their big sister. They weren't about to leave her there alone without company. And so they continued for many more Sundays until Pauline was gone. They never had an accident. They were never found out. But now, with another Thanksgiving past, when I think about the years ahead and how I'll move my way into that section of life they call the declining years, I only have to think about the Smith family and their unwavering courage, their valor, their gumption, and I am grateful forever that they merrily pointed the way forward. Here's wishing you, as the holidays progress, the gift of gumption. It's what you have to have if you're going to make it in this world, and it's not available in stores. So, what I did when I was picking out these stories, I tried to put them all within a reasonably close 8 years so that the events in them would be understandable and decipherable. And I tried to choose the stories that not just the things that meant something to me, but something that said something about the times and where we were going with things without going to politics, but to stick with what was real and true about those times. I have another, and we're going to stop here in a little bit for questions, and I'm actually going to try to manage a song if we can do the technical part of it. It's what people call technical is to me just a sort of magic that I don't understand. I understand some kinds of magic, like the seasons and how the dirt in the garden has bacteria in it that strives to make you smarter. I understand that sort of. I mean, I keep going to the garden every time I have trouble, but I've put these all together, and I want to mention just for a second that I do have a website, and I do have a Facebook page. That is, this Facebook page is called Yarn Spinner Media. People think I weave lamb's wool. I don't. I'm a yarn spinner. I tell big yarns, big windies. But these stories are all in the first 5 years of the radio show, and I hope that sometime I get to come back and share some from later times. And I hope you've enjoyed these. And this is one more story before the song, and I just want to thank you so much for coming, and for participating in this, and for listening, putting up with me, just for putting up with me, because I do this because I can't help it. If I was sitting here by myself, I'd be thinking up a story. So it's what I do, and I'm so grateful that there are people that are interested in listening to it, and I thank you. So I want to give you one more here that is I think about a life lesson, but maybe it's just a windy. This is called Not Exactly Memory Lane. It was written in May of 2012. You would think that with May Day just passed, I'd be telling you a May Day story. And someday I will. But other things have been cooking in this overcooked hillbilly brain, and so I've wandered off. And now I'm taking you with me. This is no doubt another age-related post, but as I'm fairly age-related myself, I guess you'll just have to bear with me. Here's the thing. I've been doing some traveling lately on various errands, not all of them health-related, but some, and I found myself doing some rather lengthy stints in the car alone. Radio reception, even with the hard work KSMU does to maintain it, is not always the best through the ups and downs of the watersheds, and so there are periods of time and quiet left to one's own thoughts. It was in the middle of one of those periods, when taking a trip down memory lane, or what we're prone to calling memory lane, that I suddenly realized that on this trip I was not in fact on memory lane, but somewhere just south of Memory Swamp, near Memory Crag, and not all that far from Memory Precipice. Not a good place to end up on a chilly, cloudy day, as I discovered while driving into the desolate village of Lament. But then I had to admit, while rounding the corner from Wistful into Wisteria, that such a destination is not nearly such a bad place while driving through the springtime Ozarks as when trying to fall back to sleep after a dream of a lost loved one, or chewing the elderly bones of resentment over someone who once promised you the moon when they did not in fact have the moon. Yes, it's true. The older you get, the more you amass collections of stuff in your memory basement to dig up and worry over at odd moments, especially when the time for doing anything that could change or better the outcome is long past. There was that kid who broke my favorite cudgel, which is a knobby branch that I found useful in the days of no friends at a new school, useful both as a toy and as a weapon as needed. It wasn't that he disarmed me that made me remember it for 60-some years. It was that he laughed about it. Then there was the friend who betrayed a trust and then had the nerve to die without making amends. On the opposite end, and always available to chew on, is my own long-ago casual thoughtlessness that wounded a friend and is still unhealed. And as always, all those acts in the arrogance of youth that counted friendships less important than winning. The list goes on. But then so does the spring day. And eventually the sun came out, and I arrived home and headed out to the garden. And somewhere in the solitude of the garden, where I often go to get my hands in the reality of earth, I made my way back to the present tense, where I have landed more or less intact after my journey through regrets and remorse. I have come to make peace, if not with others, at least with myself. It is here I find that other memories surface. Picking boatloads of yellow squash that my mother dredged in cornmeal and served with potatoes and okra in summer. Walking down a country lane full of waving grasses, Queen Anne's lace, and black-eyed Susans, to my cousin Janice's house in hopes her mother was making what she called garden goulash, a stew of fresh tomatoes, onions, macaroni, and ground beef, served with green beans, with potatoes and bacon, sliced tomatoes, and sweet corn. Oh, my Lord. From there, It's a short trip. Through the summer, I helped my Aunt Juanita harvest apricots and Belle of Georgia peaches from her trees in California early in the morning of another 100-degree day, biting into a peach for breakfast and having the juice poured out over my chin and down my arms to the elbows. The bees loved my elbows almost as much as the peaches. No laments can come here, except for times long gone and never forgotten, times of food, friendship, and an intense, heartfelt joy that springs up unannounced like rhubarb. Many religions say the garden is as close to God's heart as you can get. It would be hard to argue that life began anywhere else. A garden feeds you and your family. Gardens in plural feed the world. But they're more than a factory to fill the stomach. They also feed the soul, ease heart's pain, and heal the weary traveler, whatever the journey, either at its end or as a stop along the road. Here, every act is an act of faith, trusting the bean to always be a bean and never a tomato, trusting the sun to not sear and the rain to be plentiful and on time, setting plants out to grow for the sheer joy of watching it happen. And as you grow older, it is also a growing awareness that one day you may be planting fruit that someone else may harvest, and trees under whose shade you may never sit. There's nothing wrong with that. It's our investment in the eternal, our participation in the passing of seasons. Plant, grow, harvest, repeat. Good advice for the garden and the gardener. This is Marideth Sisco for the gardens and the gardeners in these Ozark Hills. I hope you enjoyed this. I certainly have. I hadn't listened to those stories in a long time. It was almost like somebody else wrote them. And now what I'm going to try to do is get this queued up here. Let me see. Do we still have time? We sort of do. I'm going to cue up this song and hopefully have some accompaniment to it, and I'll sing that to you. Then we're going to pause and have some questions before we end. So bear with me while I wrestle with technology and see if we can get this to happen. Okay. Hope this is one of your favorites. It's one of mine. Oh, Shenandoah, I long to see you away, rolling river. Oh, Shenandoah, I'll always grieve you away. I'm bound away across the wide Missouri. Oh, Shenandoah, I long to hear you, your water song, you singing river. My roving heart is always near you. You see, this song was about the Shenandoah River. Away, I'm bound away across the wide Missouri. The homesteaders waiting to cross the Missouri River got homesick and thinking about their home in Virginia, and they wrote this song. Then it went down the rivers to New Orleans and went to Britain. They didn't know what a Shenandoah was, and so they made up an Indian princess and sent it back to us. And we've been singing the wrong words this whole time. This is what I think those words were. So I rewrote it. It's called the folk process. You can do that, just change it. And here we go. I left my home. I left my family. Never more to see their faces. For that siren's call of far-off places away. I'm bound away across the wide Missouri. Away, I'm bound away across the wide Missouri. Thank you so much. So, Lisa, there you are. I can't hear you. I don't know what's happening.
Oh, sorry. I had myself on mute. Sorry there, Meredith. That was gorgeous. I was just kind of sitting here being lulled into this wonderful reverie with your song. That was beautiful. And you know, I love how you interweave the story and the song. It's beautiful. Love it.
Thank you.
And
so, do we have questions?
Well, we do have a question. We have before the questions, we have a lot of love coming in. I just want you to know, lots of people saying, Joyce says, I am in tears. Love this. Sarah says, heartfelt thanks. Thank you so much. It is our pleasure, says Joyce. And it's interesting. There's a couple people that have commented that know Butterfield. Joyce says, my grandparents are buried in Butterfield. And then
What's
I think
Joyce's name?
Slater. Joyce
Okay.
Slater. My grandparents are buried in Butterfield.
Wow. Wow.
So
cool.
lots of love coming here. Sarah says, oh, wow, my folks came to Roaring River, Eagle Rock area prior to Civil War, and my father grew up there.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Yeah. My grandparents were down at Golden, Missouri. That was where my dad's family settled. Down at Golden. It's close to Eagle Rock. Yeah. Very cool.
Yeah. And Joyce, by the way, you asked her the name. Joyce says, my grandparents were Johnsons.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Oh, yeah. I think I'm related to him. I think so. Yeah. So I see a question over here. It says, what advice for people who want to write their stories, who are staring at that blank page, wanting to write about their experiences? You write, this is your name, and this is my story, and wait to see what comes out of the end of your pen. And here's the exercise. You set yourself before the page, you get ready to write, you give yourself a beginning, and you either write or you sit there. You don't do anything else. You don't listen to the radio. You don't sing. You don't read a book. You sit there. And pretty soon you'd rather write. So,
you know, this is probably a good time to mention, and Jerica, I hope I'm saying that name right. She had a question, or are there any future events with Meredith or any of the groups that help put this together? And yes, the answer is yes. Yeah. Meredith is actually going to be giving a workshop tomorrow. She's giving a workshop on researching historical stories. You see how Meredith kind of weaved in history and bits of history, and she has a very unique approach to that. And so she's giving a workshop tomorrow. It's free. You do need to register for it. And Mark or somebody, we can put the link up there. It's showing up on, showing up on the screen now, mymcpl.org/state of stories, and you can find the workshop information. I believe it's at 10:30. Is that correct, yes. Mark? I think that's right. Yes.
Yeah, it's 10:30 to 12:30, and we'll have fun.
Yep. So Meredith's a great person to kind of lead that workshop, because she really does weave in folk, not only, you know, the written down history, but the folk history. You get a real sense of the area and the culture. Mm-hmm. So we have, it looks like a couple people are registered. And Jerica said, what unexpected instant gratification.
Good. Glad to hear it.
That's wonderful. And also, just to mention, Jerica, this State of Stories will be going on all year. So every month, if you check out that website, you'll see author readings. There will be digital storytelling workshops. There'll be more storytellers. So there'll be lots of events, and they're all free. So hopefully you can join us there.
Yeah, and we have some dandy storytellers in this state, so there'll be lots to listen to. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So I don't see too many. Oh, yeah. The link to actually that specific workshop, they just put it up there. So excellent, Jerica. It looks like you're going to join. That's excellent.
Good deal.
So let's see. Some other comments coming in. Looks like some people are, this is wonderful because when you share a story, it generates other memories and stories.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes.
Take a moment to read through the chat. There's lots of people. Sarah says, my great uncle Judge Tucker went to Golden after the Civil War. Joyce says, I think Joyce is talking about maybe her grandfather. He helped build a church and the high school so his kids could go to school. Mm-hmm. And Terry says, hello, cousin Meredith.
Howdy. I bet that's Terry Henderson down in Texas.
I think it is. It's a Terry Henderson.
Yep.
So I don't know if there are any other questions. There's a lot of love and a lot, this is what storytelling is all about. It's about fostering community.
You know what, Lisa, if we have time, I want to tell a story on Terry. Talking about storytelling, collecting stories out of your family and all that. I grew up knowing the story of my great grandfather who came home from the Civil War, chased by a couple of fellas for some reason we didn't know. And he shot them. He killed them. They tried to kill him and he killed them, put their bodies in an old well at another abandoned homestead, took their horses all the way to Carthage and turned them loose up there so that nobody would find out about him. And that's all we knew. And Terry is my great grandfather had two children, Manfred and Myrtle, and Terry is from Myrtle, and I'm from Manfred, and we didn't know each other until the old time festival in West Plains, when a cousin of ours in common, I didn't know she was a cousin. We'd sung together back in college, but I didn't know. And we're standing there talking to each other. And so she said, where are you from? I said, I'm from Butterfield. And she said, Butterfield? She said, my great grandfather was postmaster there until 1923. I said, well, that's because my Uncle Tom became the postmaster in 1923. And we kept trading things. And finally she said, my God, Meredith, we're related to each other. And we traced it back. So she went home and called Terry, who came up to see us, and brought the story of Mark Gentry and why he rode away from town being chased by these two guys. And they all went off and disappeared and nobody knew whatever happened to him. I knew what happened to him. So we had a story that was 150 years old that we put back together again. It was the most amazing thing. I will forever be grateful for that.
I love that. That's phenomenal. I love the process, the community kind of process of how to build a story. Yeah. And Michael, I think Michael Meacham, I love how you made sure to let people know folk music is ever evolving.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. It really is that folk process. You look at Bob Dylan's songs, a whole lot of them he wrote the lyrics to, but the tunes are from songs far, far back in the long ago. And he just, once they become public domain, you can use them. And he did. And I did the same thing with Shenandoah because I went to an event up in St. Joseph and was sitting out at a campfire at the riverside. And I said, why is this place significant? And they said, well, it's the place people cross the river to go on the Oregon Trail. And I was sitting there thinking about that and thinking at that time, it was just a path in the grass. And if you lived and followed the path, you'd get to Oregon eventually or not. And whatever happened, nobody will ever know what happened to you. And of course they were homesick and thinking back to all they'd left behind that they'd never see again. And they wrote that song, and then it came around to the way it is now. And I thought, well, that's not the story. The story's wandered off someplace. And so I tried to recreate it in this other version. So it was a labor of love because I was so moved by sitting there and thinking about those people looking ahead and looking behind, and what an amazingly, what courage. I mean, it would be like just stepping off and going to Mars,
Yeah.
were amazing.
We have and Rita says, I like your version of the song better than the original, by the way.
Thank you.
We had a question come in from Beth. So did you find out why your great-grandfather was being chased?
Yeah.
Hate not to know now that you've said you found out why from Cousin Terry.
Yeah. What happened was that he was coming home from the war and he fell in with this fellow who was a doctor, but he was also a spy for the Union, and he would ferret out Confederate sympathizers and shoot them. But the war was over, and they're riding into this little town, and this fellow comes up, and the doctor says something to him that's kind of an odd thing to say, but it was the code that they used to talk to each other. The fellow answered him, and he pulled out a gun and shot him, and then rode away. And people came out, and they thought my great-grandfather had shot the man, and they were going to string him up. They're going to yank him into the courthouse and have a trial and hang him. But somebody came wandering down the street and said, no, he wasn't the one. It was that guy that rode off. Well, these two friends of the fellow who was shot decided they were going to take revenge anyway. And so they followed him when he left. Turns out that the fellow that was shot got well and lived another 30 years. But his friends went off down there and rode up to his house and rode around the house firing into the windows, trying to kill the whole family. But he knew they were coming, and he got the family out in the woods. And when they finished shooting all their bullets, he shot them.
Wow.
And nobody up there ever knew what happened to those guys. And I'm sitting down here knowing nothing of the story, but I knew what happened to those guys. It's amazing that story ever found its way back to linking up.
Yeah.
So much of history is lost that way, but I'm grateful for that little fragment that got stitched back together.
Yeah. Jerica said, I've heard a similar story about my great-great-grandfather. I'll have to check with my father and see if we're related. So
yeah.
I love this. Yeah. So if you have any other questions, maybe some last-minute questions here, I think this is going to be a great workshop tomorrow. Everything you said about these kind of little bits of history that can be lost, and how can you research that history, and how can you create stories out of it? It'll be a good workshop.
Yep. If you're lucky, you've got old people to talk to that will remember things.
That's the best resource of all.
Yes, indeed. Well, thanks everybody so much. This has been really fun.
Yeah. It's been wonderful, and I want to thank on behalf of the University of Missouri Extension and the St. Louis Storytelling Festival. I want to thank the Story Center at Mid-ContinentPublicLibrary, and I think we're going to have some music to ring us out here, so sit back and enjoy.
Yeah, and
the mockingbird sings. Time to pay attention to growing things. Deep in the woods, in a long, cool valley where the water runs clear as gin, I open my heart and drink my fill of the rich, deep current of life always running through these